Guys, shut the up so we can get this over with.
Thank you.
Shut the up.
Dana White has never shied away from getting into a confrontation with his UFC fighters. Although the fighters under the UFC roster might be monsters and some of the scariest people on the planet, Dana's not one to budge to their gimmicks or beef. And it can be assured that the UFC president has beefed with a range of people in the business, from promoters to the media and even his own fighters under contract. Being in the business for 20 years, you would assume there must have been some clashes, and there has been. So in today's video, we'll be discussing some athletes who hate Dana White and why. But before we get into the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel with notifications turned on so you don't miss any of the new videos we post. The first athlete who hates Dana is Ben Askren. Like Dana White, Ben Askren is also known for having an incredibly outspoken personality. He was a hugely successful welterweight outside of the UFC, fighting for both Bellator and one championship. When he finally signed for the UFC, the love-hate relationship between him and the UFC president was immediately evident. Both men could be seen with their arms around each other when Askren was initially signed, appearing to both be in good spirits. However, Askren later refused to shake White's hand at the UFC 235 weigh-ins. Askren has also repeatedly mocked White whenever he got on the mic. Next up, we have Mark Hunt. One of the UFC's most tenured fighters at heavyweight, Mark Hunt's grudge against Dana has actually only come somewhat recently, since the summer of 2016, but it arguably burns more strongly than any other on this list. Currently embroiled in a lawsuit against the UFC while still remaining on their roster, Hunt has accused Zuffa, mainly Dana, of everything from fight fixing to racketeering to ignoring doping from other fighters. In a way, the Aussie star has a point. He was selected to fight Brock Lesnar when the WWE star and former UFC champion decided to return to MMA at UFC 200 last summer. And despite USADA now overseeing the UFC's anti-doping program, Lesnar was allowed to re-enter testing relatively late due to a weird loophole. Brock went on to beat Hunt by unanimous decision, but then tested positive for the banned performance enhancer clomiphene. Hunt was furious, stating he was sick of fighting steroid-enhanced opponents, as he'd already taken on Antonio Silva and Ben Rothwell in the past. He accused the UFC of turning a blind eye towards doping and hit them with a lawsuit. Although he has continued to fight since, a booking against Marcin Tybura was terminated after the UFC brass had concerns over an interview that saw Hunt admit to memory loss, a possible sign of CTE. Since then, Hunt's fury towards Dana has only grown. He let out an expletive-laden rant towards Dana and the UFC following his removal from the Tybura fight and has vowed to bring the UFC down. If he were given the chance, he'd probably knock that bloke out, as he so loves to say. Third on the list is Frank Shamrock. The majority of fighters who fall out with Dana White tend to kiss and make up eventually, even the most bitter ones. The fact is that more money can be made if both parties simply get along. The same cannot be said for Frank Shamrock, one of the UFC's most legendary champions and one of the greatest MMA fighters of all time. Retired and working as a UFC commentator when Dana took over the company in 2001, Shamrock quickly fell out with the president for reasons that remain largely foggy. Since then, however, he's literally done everything within his power to harm the UFC, be it bad-mouthing Dana in every interview he does, or joining forces with every rival promotion to spring up, including Bellator, Strikeforce, and Elite XC. He's even issued veiled threats towards Dana in some of his interviews, triggering the UFC president to label him as mentally unstable. Shamrock's relationship with the UFC is so bad that despite being one of their most decorated champions, the original 205-pound title holder, with an impressive 4 successful title defenses, he's been largely erased from UFC history. Even the likes of any other athlete haven't been treated that badly. Shamrock is definitely one man Dana ought to avoid if he's out and about. Up next, we have Demetrious Johnson. The reigning UFC flyweight champion, Demetrious Johnson has been labeled the best pound-for-pound fighter in the world by many people, Dana White included. He's also classy enough that he appears to have buried his hatchet with the UFC president, for the time being at least. How much longer that will last, given Dana's volatile nature, though, is anyone's guess. Johnson's beef with the UFC and Dana stemmed from the fact that after 10 successive title defenses, the UFC wanted him to fight former bantamweight champion TJ Dillashaw in a so-called super fight, with Dillashaw dropping to 125 pounds to challenge Johnson. Johnson felt that Dillashaw would be unable to make the weight and said he'd prefer to fight Ray Borg, a ranked challenger but a much lesser-known name than Dillashaw. In an astonishing rant on social media, Johnson explained the reaction from Dana and the UFC brass to this decision. Apparently, they'd tried to lowball his pay, tried to force his hand into fighting Dillashaw, and even threatened to dissolve the entire flyweight division. Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed, and Johnson delivered another successful defense against Borg. But with Dillashaw now holding the bantamweight title and calling again for the super fight with Johnson, this situation could raise its ugly head again. Another athlete who's known to hate Dana is Luke Rockhold. It's been over a year since former middleweight champ Luke Rockhold lost his belt to Michael Bisping, who took the fight on short notice and shocked the MMA world. He is expected to return to the octagon again against former World Series of Fighting middleweight and light heavyweight champ David Branch. He has had words with Dana White twice in the last couple years, and neither time has been nice. Back in 2015, shortly after Rockhold choked out Lyoto Machida, Dana made a comment about American Kickboxing Academy, the gym at which Rockhold trains primarily, being Stone Age for their intense training regimen that often leads to injured fighters. Rockhold responded by essentially saying they were the best camp in the world and that other people's opinions are irrelevant. Back in May, when the idea of George St. Pierre taking on Michael Bisping for the middleweight championship was looking likely, Rockhold took to Twitter to question such a decision. Dana and Rockhold had an unfriendly back and forth that included Luke telling the president, "Think before you run your mouth," and Dana countering with, "Stick to fighting and modeling and leave the matchmaking to us." Following Rockhold on the list is Tito Ortiz. This will go down as one of the biggest and pettiest beef in UFC history. This is also arguably the most famous feud in Dana's career. The feud got to a point where Dana actually trained to fight the Hall of Famer. Tito and White started to despise each other over a battle of words and a contract issue. White said Tito is the most dishonest man I have ever met in an interview. Dana admitted that he hated Ortiz so much that he once asked for Chuck Liddell's trunks and gloves that he used to beat Tito Ortiz. It was no more Chuck versus Tito on the fight nights. It was Dana and Chuck versus Tito Ortiz. That's how bad it got, but several reports have said that they are okay now, but Tito continues to talk about the injustice in the promotion. The next athlete we have who hates Dana is Nate Diaz. This may be a somewhat recent hatred, but the Diaz brothers, particularly Nate, seem to have a powerful hatred for Dana White. While Nate Diaz's two fights were a 1-1 split with fellow smack talker Conor McGregor in March and August of 2016, he hasn't bothered to fight since. Nick, on the other hand, was on a 3-fight losing skid, having been beaten by Carlos Condit and George St. Pierre in 2012 and 2013, and then losing to Anderson Silva, although the loss was overturned with both fighters testing positive for banned substances. Nick was initially suspended for 5 years, but that ban was brought down to 18 months. He could have fought in August, but has yet to accept a bout. Dana White has mentioned in the past few months that he doesn't know whether either of them will ever fight again. Nick has remained relatively quiet, but Nate, who White had accused of turning down fights, offered this on Twitter saying, "He can't stop making stuff up about me, and I haven't been offered any fights except the one laughed at." Who is telling the truth? Who knows? Either way, it seems Nate isn't Dana's biggest fan these days. The ninth and final athlete who hates Dana is Conor McGregor. The UFC's biggest star, Conor McGregor, has typically had a relatively strong relationship with the UFC president. This was damaged in 2020, however, as both men took issue with the other. McGregor was incredibly keen to get a fight booked and began to get frustrated with the UFC and White's lack of work in this department. This led to McGregor releasing screenshots of messages between him and White in an attempt to get something moving. But White did not appreciate the move and was openly vocal about how he believed it was a betrayal of trust from the Irishman. The two men appear to have reconciled, but who could say how long that'll last when the unpredictable Notorious is involved? With that said, that's going to wrap up this video. Thanks for watching.